Så, välkomna till Goto 10, Internetstiftelsens mötesplats för internetrelaterade kunskapsutbyten och innovation. Or I should say, welcome to Goto 10, the Swedish Internet Foundation's space for internet-related knowledge exchange and innovation. Today's event will be held in English. And if you have any questions or comments that you would like to add at the end of the discussion, you're very welcome to pose them in Swedish or English as you see fit, for your convenience, of course. But remember that you will need to use a mic to ask them. For those of you who do not yet know me, my name is Isadora Hellegren, and I have the great privilege of introducing this panel today and moderating this conversation that we will be having. Today's event is part of Your Data and Your Democracy. It's a series of events focusing on issues related to the internet, society, and democracy at large. And through these events, the Swedish Internet Foundation works actively to open up the conversation between different actors to shine light on these often very complex issues through multiple perspectives. We started this series in October 2018, and it has since proven to be highly appreciated by many of you. So I would really like to thank everyone who is here today and for your continued engagement in these discussions. And if you have only just now discovered this series, I would like to recommend you to check out our YouTube series on Goto 10, or Goto 10's own YouTube channel, where we have a playlist ready of data and democracy videos. With that said, today's event is also live streamed, so I would like to take the opportunity to say welcome to everyone who might be tuning in online. It is great to have you here. So today's event focuses on post-truth, fake news, and democracy. Our democracies are at stake, they say, as fake news, disinformation, and propaganda circulate the web. This statement has become a dominating narrative among politicians or political actors generally, and others who claim that the very foundations of truth are shaken. As a response, many countries and institutions are working to come up with various measures and strategies to counter the spread of fake news online. And during this panel discussion today, we will talk about the very relationship between democracy and truth. We will also talk about these various strategies that are used or being implemented to counter the spread of fake news, disinformation, and propaganda in order to promote democracy. Today's event is a follow-up conversation on our previous Data and Democracy event. In December, one of our panelists here, Johan Farkas, he joined us at Goto 10 to give a talk based on his recent research and publication entitled Post-Truth, Fake News and Democracy, Mapping the Politics of Falsehood, which he co-published with Yannick Sko. I never say his name correctly, but I try. I will continue trying. Johan, who specializes in disinformation research, argued, among other things then, that the way we talk about democracy today through so-called post-truth discourses presuppose certain understandings that we may have or not have of what democracy is or ought to be in relation to truth. He argued that democracy has never actually really been just about truth, evidence, or rationality, but that it is equally about the voice of the democratic people. And that our pursuit of truth, or perhaps even the ways which we are currently working to battle the spread of so-called fake news, then, might actually end up deepening existing democratic problems. So this talk sparked a lot of questions, and we could clearly see the need and hear the call for further discussion on this topic together with different actors who are involved in efforts to counter the spread of disinformation and to promote democracy in Sweden. So here we are. And I'm very happy to introduce our panelists here, who are Ida Littell. Ida is the project manager for the national campaign No Hate Speech Movement, which is run by the Swedish Media Council on behalf of the government. Ida has worked as a journalist for many years, and her focus is now on how young people handle facts, threats, and hatred in their everyday life on the internet. And we have Carl Heath, the Vice President of Education at RISE, Research Institutes of Sweden, where he leads their mission to be a leading actor in professional education. He's also the Special Counsel for the Commission for Media and Information Literacy and Democratic Dialogue. Johan Farkas, a PhD student in Media and Communication Studies at Malmö University. Johan's research engages with the intersection of digital media platforms, disinformation, politics, journalism, and democracy. And if you missed out on his previous talk here at Goto 10, it is also available on our YouTube channel. But now I would like to stop talking and give you all some more space here. This is what we're here for, after all, to hear your thoughts on the matter. But I would like to begin by asking you all to answer this very first question with a basic yes or no, and then you will get the opportunity to develop your position. Does the spread of fake news, disinformation, and propaganda actually threaten our democracy today? Ida, would you like to begin? Yes or no first?
Yes.
Johan.
Yes, to some degree.
If I emphasize the word threaten, then yes.
Okay, now we will, I would like to hear more about this. Why would we need to emphasize the word threaten?
Well, it's I'm thinking about it from a sort of more future space rather than it being sort of a definite situation is or is not, because both democracy and our environments where we have democratic discourse, they are sort of a fluid and changing thing. It's not something that's fixed. So when we say sort of is democracy threatened? Well, yes, to some extent that would be the case, but it's such a complex and fluid environment that it's hard to just say sort of is democracy at large threatened? No, I wouldn't think so, especially not in a Swedish context where we have quite strong a strong grounding foundation for our democracy and how we enact democracy. But then there are aspects that are threatened, and those we could talk about, obviously. Yeah.
Ida, you said that it is threatened for sure. Would you like to develop?
Yeah, for sure. I don't know, but I think that if we see live stream deadly attacks on, for example, Facebook and other platforms, I think it's a threat, of course. And I ask myself, and I ask just a question: how will this affect, or how will this affect our digital democracy, and how will this affect our children's digital democracy? That's an open question.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there are specific threats, and we should address them as being specific and different. And that's the problem with the kind of fake news notion, that it just tries to capture everything. So there are specific threats, but then at the same time, and that is what we address in this book Isadora mentioned, is I see that right now I actually feel there are bigger threats with the way in which this is being discussed, at least in many countries, and the way it is being addressed through censorship laws and through increased power to private corporations. So therefore, I would say again, a bit, yes, it is threatened, and we should deal with those concrete threats. But at the same time, there is a big threat from this very vague and broad debate about fake news and post-truth, and that we should just restore truth at all costs, because that can certainly hurt democracy in the process.
So let's talk about this then. Let's go to this question right away, the relationship between truth and democracy. As you mentioned, that the quest for trying to establish truth at all costs might actually be missing out on the larger issues that are at stake here for our democracies. Why is that? And what are those issues in that case?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, but I mean, to try to break it down, what we have seen again is that these concrete threats which are there online and which should be addressed and are different from each other, they have been lumped under this heading of post-truth and fake news, and it has been described as if it's something we can just remove and then we have fixed it. But first of all, again, that neglects that removing stuff, that involves a lot of power in terms of who gets to decide what gets removed and who do we want to give that power, and how does that actually make people feel about democracy or feel about their relation to politics. And I think there are some key threats, and this is why right now we're seeing a lot of countries, especially in weak democracies, implementing laws against fake news, simply making it illegal to spread fake news. And that has really, really taking on a life of its own. And again, if we look at how this has been debated, it makes a lot of sense. We have fake news and it needs to be eradicated by all costs. Why not make it illegal? But we can, of course, quickly see that is not a democratic path, or it can easily become an undemocratic path, because who gets to decide what gets to be illegal in a country? And isn't democracy all about being able to speak up? At the same time, it kind of neglects some of the underlying causes of all of this. We have to ask, why is there a low trust in democracy in many countries? And that has been declining in the US, for example, way before social media, or way before we started talking about post-truth. So when we address it, which we should, disinformation, for example, we should talk about, there is a concrete threat here, for example, foreign nations trying to infiltrate political debate through fake accounts. That's something I've studied. When we study that, we find out there's not a lot of fake news typically being spread there. The information is typically not false. They infiltrate political movements. They try to polarize opinions and boost certain political opinions. And that is a threat, for example. But it's not going to even go away by you making fake news illegal, because most of the information they're sharing is not fake, per se. And so, for example, that threat, how do we address that? We can definitely talk, I can talk for a long time about that, and we should, but it's a specific, limited threat that we need to address. And by talking about it as post-truth and fake news, we're kind of missing the point, and might even, I would say, hurt our democracy in some way. That was a long answer. Sorry about that.
Would you like to answer to that, or Ida or Carl?
Yeah, but I agree, and I think that this how disinformation has influenced election campaigns. That's something we just seen now in the beginning. It's going to be a new election coming up here in the States, and that's I think we're going to see some new ways for the disinformation in that election.
Speaking to the question of truth and democracy, I think, and the issues concerning disinformation, for example, I see that there's sort of some issues that we have had a hard time tackling, and where sort of the landscape has evolved quite fast. So just sort of going back in time 15 or 20 years or so, when we spoke about a democratic dialogue in a country, we spoke about a dialogue that usually was not mediated by technology. It was usually mediated in the air, in one way, shape, or form, or through mass media. When we have that type of conversation on digital platforms, we get a new kind of structure to the conversation, where the conversational discourse is in some sense informed by the structures of the platform in and of itself. We can see that, for example, when it comes to spread of disinformation, that disinformation spreads very differently depending on what technological platform that disinformation is, or if it's in pamphlets or in the spoken word. And so when we have these discussions, the questions between truth and democracy is not only a question between sort of sender and receiver, but also the sort of mediated space around that. The sort of asking ourselves the question, sort of, what is digital public space, and how is that digital public space designed? Who designed it? To what extent? By what laws and regulations? And there's a sort of a whole conversation there that I think we've just sort of started to have, and it's a hard question, a hard conversation to have, because we usually pull it down to talk about one given specific platform. We talk about Facebook, or we talk about Twitter, or Snap, or whatnot. But then it's a sort of moving field, and suddenly we have a large extent of our youth being on a Chinese-owned social media, TikTok, for example, with its totally new dynamic. So we need to sort of, I think, when we discuss these things, just going back to what you state, sort of be much more granular and precise in our conversations. How do we frame these conversations? Because it's only when we can sort of bring ourselves down to that sort of more specific conversation that it becomes easy to address the complex matters at hand.
You wanted to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. And I think, I mean, there needs to be a big conversation about regulation of tech. But again, I think right now, when there is talk about regulation of tech, it's too often about getting them to remove stuff in a very opaque way. And in many ways taking over the role of our judiciary system, for example, that Facebook should be in charge of deciding what goes out or what is removed. And I think, again, I understand where it comes from. It's, again, from this thinking that if we just remove what is bad, we will be left with what is good. But we have to ask, like, is democracy better equipped by having these giant companies really making all these decisions in terms of what is what should be allowed in our democratic debate? Shouldn't that be within our democratic arenas? So again, I think we definitely need to regulate tech, and I think sometimes in Scandinavia there is this sense, but we are too small to do so. And again, we through the European Union, of course, regulation of tech might be more achievable. But I think even if Sweden wanted or Denmark wanted, I mean, there is the possibility of regulating. It's just kind of a discourse that, but they are too big. It's not something. It's too complex. We can't do that. But I think with new technologies being introduced in democracy throughout the 20th century, there has been these kind of debates. Okay, television is here. Do we want political ads during elections on television? Maybe, maybe not. Like these kinds of conversations need to be had around social media. But I just feel that the post-truth debate and fake news debate sometimes actually clouds our thinking in terms of actually addressing the issues.
So now we're talking a bit about the mediation of content, the mediation of information, how it reaches us, in what format it reaches us, and how it spreads, etc. But what about the content itself? You said earlier that maybe there's not so much fake, but the fact that who is behind it and what the purpose is. But then there is also the spread of misinformation or disinformation, so to speak, purposefully. And how do we address that content-wise? Why does it matter? Does it matter that it actually spreads things that are not true? And how do we know if they're true? And because we said earlier that there is a certain threat to this, that it spreads. If we talk about just the content, that it reaches people.
Yeah, we the Swedish Media Council, we're working a lot with educational material. We are our target groups are schools and educators and social workers, and we've done a lot of material just about this, and to give people information about how to decode memes or photos, pictures online, and because we think that these are, I think we see this communication system online with this with coded references, and if we don't understand that, if young people and grown-ups don't understand it, it's going to be a bigger problem. And I can tell you that we've done this Bilder och verkligheter. It's a new educational material just about this. So there are many tools and materials around, and we have them for free at the Swedish Media Council. It's just
Okay, well, while we're at that, or did you want to add something?
I would just want to sort of hang on to what.
Great. Yes.
From my perspective, what you're saying is obviously really valuable and important. Sort of having in place a media and information literacy environment that caters to the whole population is really important in order to sort of curb the spread of disinformation and misinformation. During the past year, I've had a look around Sweden specifically, but also other countries, but mainly Sweden, looking into sort of what material is out there and who is it targeted towards and such. And we can see that there's really good stuff being produced. The council's work is one example of that, and Internetstiftelsen as well. But what we also can see is that quite a number of these materials are targeting target groups that usually are, or where we have an easy access to them, and where we perceive it to be more important to spread it. For example, in educational environments and libraries, we have quite a high sort of easy access to those environments from a government perspective. But then we can see that there are other target groups that are likewise important for us to reach, but where the it's not just that easy to, from a sort of government perspective, to actually inform in a meaningful manner, especially when it comes to grown-ups, people living and working all around the country. It's really, really tough. And also retirees. How do we reach sort of the whole population? We can see that using these kinds of materials to inform is important, but it is a question sort of how do we reach the population at large. I would want to add to that, and tying into what you alluded to initially, is that providing information on media information literacy as a means to sort of curb disinformation and propaganda is obviously really important. Can't stress that enough. But I don't see that is the only solution to this problem, and it becomes, sometimes we have a tendency to sort of instrumentalize our solutions. We see a threat and then we go at it with this particular, and then we can sort of check a box and we're done. And this is a much more broad and complex issue, and I think we need to target it through various different ways. We've spoken about information and media information literacy. That's important. Another approach that is outside of the scope of my commission, but is another important discussion, is the one that you raised about regulation. But then a third sort of pillar that I'm coming to become more and more interested in this conversation is actually sort of looking towards our public commons together and see sort of what can we do in order to enhance democracy and strengthen democracy through sort of institutional perspective. Democracy isn't sort of a given thing that is fixed forever in just the same way. Democracy today, as it was during the time of Platon, isn't the same. And it's not the same just 100 years ago when we got sort of the freedom or the right to vote for women, for example. It's a sort of moving target, and I think we need to sort of address and live democracy every day, and through doing that, sort of raise awareness that sort of can curb misinformation and disinformation by strengthening our commons, basically.
Right, Ida wanted to add something there.
I was thinking about journalism, which is one cornerstone of our democratic society. It's facing a lot of challenges today, and hate speech and threats, it's also a threat towards the freedom of the press. And we see this local journalism, it's fighting for its survival. And I think that as unguarded media areas expand, there's a risk that disinformation will feel this, the feel of lack with disinformation. The feel, sorry, pardon my English, I'm going to say like this. There's a risk that undemocratic forces feel the lack of local journalism with disinformation. That's a problem, I think.
I know I'm going back in terms of my questions here, but I think sometimes it's important that we also ask this, why is that bad? Why is that dangerous? Filling the gap of the local journalism. Why is journalism crucial for democracy, for example?
I think what this points to, and I really like what you guys are saying in terms of thinking, both in terms of kind of a long game, and again, it's by educating kids, for example, having strong education as being good for democracy. That is something, I mean, we knew that before we started talking about fake news and post-truth, right? But so it's kind of these core elements that we know work, and then we have to think about, okay, what are the what are the causes, what are like the underlying mechanisms of disinformation being spread, instead of just focusing on the content. And there I think, and why there is less disinformation in Scandinavia than we see in other countries, is that the feeling of distance between people and politicians is not as great as in the US, for example. And I think like all conspiracy theories, for example, they start with the federal government is covering something up for you, right? And I mean, in order to have an environment where you start believing in that, you need to first distrust that government a whole lot, right? So these are like the fundamental issues. How do we make sure that people feel that distance is not too great? And how do we also feel that they are part of it, not just being talked to? And again, I think Scandinavia has a strong tradition of these things. And I also think this is why Scandinavia is not as vulnerable. But these things have also been declining. I mean, participation in terms of being member of a political party, and these things have been declining. And I don't think we should look back and then say, like, we should reestablish that necessarily, but we need to think about what could be new ways of enhancing democratic debate and reducing that sense of distance, which is also growing in our countries. And so, yeah, but I think that is where it lies, and it really has some to... When we then start addressing that, we actually quite quickly move away from fake news itself or disinformation itself. I think in the end, democracy can certainly handle that some people think that that the earth is flat, or that we weren't on the moon, or these kinds of things. Democracy can certainly handle that. And I think it's a very dangerous path to think that we should remove that. Because again, democracy is about thinking ahead and thinking into the unknown, and having ideas about where we are going. And if we have too much regulation saying, no, now you are saying something which is out of line, I mean, we can quickly see the kind of authoritarian tendencies that will come out of that. And I think that is exactly, again, what we're seeing with all these countries implementing these fake news laws, which are criticized across the board by human rights groups and so forth. So I think, again, the kind of core questions doesn't actually have that much to do with how do we stop fake news. It's about how do we make sure we have a vital and vibrant democracy. And if we have that, I also think the other things are really things that can have its place. But I mean, what we can see is that the really threatening disinformation campaigns, they all come from these quite powerful sources that invest millions of dollars in spreading that. And that is whether it's the Russian campaign to infiltrate US political debates, or it's climate change denials, or these are not bottom-up movements. And so that is something, again, we can talk about. How can we regulate the amount of money you can spend in micro-targeting people in our elections, or how much do we want, how much can we increase transparency around money in politics? I mean, again, these are not questions about fake news, but they are kind of, they are the things that will address these problems.
Right. So we've been outlining a number of threats actually to democracy that are related somehow to fake news and misinformation. You've also talked about various approaches to handle it through regulation, and we talk about the intermediaries and platforms, etc. We talked about the need for journalism. We can also come back to that. I think that what could be really useful for us to establish a common ground on here is the question of democracy as well, or so-called democratic dialogue, or the demokratiska samtalet in Swedish. What do we mean by this? What are we talking about when we're talking about working for an increased democratic dialogue? What does this refer to, Carl?
Well, from my perspective, it's all about sort of all our conversations in our commons regarding how we want to live and be and act together. It's not sort of specifically sort of the political conversation in a specific question or so. But it's all these micro conversations that we all have over our kitchen tables, at cafes, on internet forums or platforms or whatnot, and how they are orchestrated and organized, where they are, how many people have access to them, how they are informed, how they are influenced, how they are mediated. All of those questions are important when it comes to sort of framing the democratic dialogue. And what we can see over the past 15 years, as I alluded to earlier, is that the sort of the arenas of conversation, the arenas for democratic dialogue, they are sort of ever-changing as a consequence of the technologies that we use. And we need to sort of address issues in that area, asking us sort of, how is democratic dialogue best facilitated through a sort of civic perspective and through us all living in a society? What is the sort of best way of organizing democratic dialogue with the technologies we have at hand or want to have at hand in order to sort of strengthen our democracy? And I think we quite rarely ask those questions. We start using things because they're utility, they're easy, they're accessible, but they might not be designed to actually have democratic dialogue. They're designed to sell ads or do other things. And I think when you sort of look around the world, we can see all kinds of really interesting sort of civil engagements into sort of looking at sort of how do we use technology as a democratic tool. There's local examples of using sort of deliberative digital democratic platforms for conversations, and there's countries who engage in it, such as Audrey Tang's work in Taiwan, for example. There's all kinds of interesting sort of ways to approach democratic dialogue, and it's not as simple as saying sort of it's when politicians engage in conversation or so, but it's all our common civic conversations and the arenas where they are present.
So what is the state of the democratic dialogue in Sweden today? How is our democracy doing?
I mean, I would say it's quite good.
Okay.
And I mean, we have a very high rate of engagement in Swedish politics. We have 87.2 people go and vote. The amount of Swedes engaging in civic society it's still a really high engagement levels. We have high engagement levels when it comes to non-traditionally organized civic engagement in new digital fora and contexts, etc. So in many ways we have quite a vivid and active democratic space. That doesn't mean that it's not under threat, but it's still, we have a very strong platform to engage in things, but that doesn't also mean that we should sort of stop. I mean, we should always try to evolve our ways and practices of democracy so they are accurate to the time that we live. I mean, all our rules and laws regarding democracy, they are informed by the times that they are enacted. So, for example, the Swedish Parliament has a very long summer vacation, and that's so that a parliamentarian can take their horse and ride home and take care of the farm during the summer, and then go back to the Parliament again. Obviously, most parliamentarians don't do that anymore, but they still have a long summer vacation, and it's just to sort of illustrate that all our rules and designs around democratic dialogue are framed in the context of the times when they are produced. And I think it's high time to sort of engage in a conversation about our times and our technologies and how we create a better democratic dialogue.
So I would like to ask you, Ida, because the efforts of No Hate Speech movement, we could say they are part of this larger frame of democratic dialogue and how you're working to increase it. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about this work and in what ways it's supposed to then contribute to improving, promoting democracy?
Yeah, the Swedish Media Council is a government agency, right? And whose primary task is to promote empowering of minors as conscious media users and to protect them from harmful media influences. And the Swedish Media Council runs this campaign, No Hate Speech Movement, and it has been a campaign since 2013, led by the Council of Europe Youth Department. And yesterday, actually, it went from No Hate Speech Movement to No Hate Speech Network. So the activists, they are developing this new network instead of a movement. So that's interesting to follow as well. And we have this campaign until this year. This is the last year for the campaign for the Swedish Media Council. So we'll see what happens afterwards. And that's also interesting because I think that the questions, they will never die. Of course, there will still be an interest. And I don't know what's going to happen afterwards, but we've had it since 2013. So many years right now.
How have you seen the responses to it?
Yeah, like I said before, we have produced a lot of educational material, and we see that the people who are using this material, they like it, but that not so many people they don't know that we exist. So we are a really small government council, but we are working hard to get to let our voices be heard. So I think that it's hard to reach young people through grown-ups because you can do it either in school or through parents. And we also have this material. It's called Digitala medier på föräldraska. I don't know the English translation there. Yeah, parental, social media. Yeah, parent speech.
Social media and parent speech.
And we see that it's been a huge interest in this material this year because of TikTok especially. So that's what we see. So we see that, and also in our survey, Kids and Media, which we do every second year, we see that parents, they need some more information about their kids' behavior, and not the behavior, not their use, how they use the internet. So that's what we try to follow.
I just wanted to tie in there when it comes to hate and violence, etc. During my commission time, I've had the privilege of going out into different municipalities all around Sweden, meeting with local politicians and civic communities, etc., discussing disinformation, propaganda, and hate on the internet, for example. And when it comes to the sort of hate perspectives on this, there we can see a real issue when it comes to democracy, and that is sort of a very specific question that we need to address, because we can see that today 1 out of 3 Swedish politicians have been reported that they have been a target of hate speech online in the past year. And we know that 1 out of 4 journalists report the same thing. And we also can see that politicians sometimes choose not to engage in a particular conversation out of the fear of the consequences of engaging in that. And we know that journalists choose not to write a particular article because they know the consequences that would bring. And that all means that obviously we have situations where politicians, due to the risk of hate, choose not to engage in the political questions that they have actually been represented to speak about. And we also see that journalists might not cover those same topics. And obviously that whole space is really, really critical to address. One means of addressing that is obviously media and information literacy campaigns, and your work and others is super important there. But it's a wider conversation about our democracy and our democratic dialogue, and how we actually have deep and meaningful engagements, both in the flesh and in our digital environments.
Right, and this might overlap with what Johan is about to say now.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is because what is, as you said, asked, what is a good democratic debate? I think, I mean, it's not about necessarily reaching agreement, but it's about people feeling that they can express themselves and be heard, and also disagree, but never question other people's right to express themselves and participate in democracy, right? And obviously hate speech violates that, right? And so we don't want hate speech in society, of course. But so the question is, how do we address that? And I think, again, right now, too much focus has been on this opaque content removal. We just need to remove it, and then it's good. I think, for example, what they've done in Germany, where they also have a tradition, I mean, of having harsher hate speech regulation, they implemented this NetzDG law, which makes it illegal for social media companies not to remove illegal content within 24 hours. But I think, for example, that is such a clear example to me of something that is good intentions, but has a really bad implication for democracy, because what you're doing is, first of all, we can ask, if people threaten to kill someone or something, is the best response to that their comment gets removed by Facebook, which I think it is certainly not, that's not enough. At the same time, there's this big risk that by just outsourcing this judgment on what is illegal hate speech and what is not, you're also giving that company a huge amount of power. And because they fear violating that law, there is a real risk as well that they will remove too much, right? And again, as these platforms have become so important for free speech and for democratic debate, I think this is not acceptable. I mean, we should then, like, within our courts of law, there should perhaps be, or within our police, there should be allocated more resources to addressing these things. I certainly think the authorities in some countries, I'm actually not sure about the state in Sweden, but have been very slow in Denmark, I feel, to react to this kind of thing online, because it's like, oh, it's on Facebook, it's not as serious. I think that is changing. But again, as long as that is handled within our courts of law, I think we are staying within the pillars of democracy, which is that people can be heard, but then also if they violate laws, they have the right to a defense and so on and so forth. And right now it's too much allocated over to these social media companies. So the same with now, everyone was complaining Facebook doesn't want to fact check politicians and remove ads during elections. And a lot of people were outraged by that. But to be honest, I don't think that should be Facebook's responsibility. Because again, I think it is giving them too much power in this. So I think, for example, we should have regulation around content moderation, that if social media companies remove something, citizens need to have some way of appealing, and they need to know that a human will look at it, which we don't know right now. And the opposite. If people violate the laws, they should know that they will get prosecuted within courts of law. And so again, I think there are real issues here that need to be addressed through regulation, but the regulation we're seeing in many countries is too much centered on just this opaque content moderation. We would just remove it and then the problem goes away. But I don't think that's how it works at all. That was a long response again.
Oh, thank you. Did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I agree in some way, and in some way not. But I think that if you build a platform, you have to take the responsibility if it's used in a way, and you have to listen to the users. And if they use it in one way, you have to I think you should take your responsibility there. That's what I wanted to say. And what else? I think that today there are really easy to compare prices online. You can compare banks. It's really easy. There are some simple methods for this. So it's not impossible to learn to compare sources and to learn quite easily who has written this, where has it been published, and I think we just have to make knowledge bigger knowledge about this, and it's a multi-staker effort who I think we need.
Right. What I'm hearing from all of our conversation here is really that the efforts of anti-fake news or anti-disinformation campaigns are very important, but they're not enough, and that our discourse should not necessarily center around this will save our democracies if only we do this. Yet there are many actors involved in Sweden today, working with different informational campaigns, including the Internet Foundation, I should say, even if we are not represented as panelists in this conversation today, that these are very important to raise or increase public awareness of various things. But you all are pointing out also other things that need to be done that to increase or to promote democracy on a national level. Have I understood you all correctly here? Is there anything you would say that, no, that's not true, we should be doing this instead, or the role of information or media literacy is bigger or smaller than we believe?
No, I would say, I mean, it is a multi-stakeholder issue, and there are different actors engaged in this context. We have us as sort of members of a society and informing members of society about how the society is orchestrated, organized, and how information spreads. And informing about media information literacy obviously becomes really important. Then we have the platforms, as we've been discussing, and how we sort of relate to platforms who uphold parts of our public discourse in a digital time. Well, obviously that is a really important perspective as well. But then we shouldn't sort of stop there, but we also need to sort of ask ourselves about our commons at large. Sort of what do we have together? How is our society organized, and how do we want our society to be organized using digital tools in an effective and meaningful way for democracy, not against democracy?
Thank you. I think this is a very good moment to look out to all of you and see if there are any questions. There are questions, and that's great. So I will borrow one of these. Let's see if I have anyone that could help me bring these around. Tack så mycket. We had one question there. Thank you.
In the physical world, when you go to the grocery store, you will see packages of things you can buy. Some of them are coming from companies that have ISO certifications or something like that to build trust to the customer. Yeah, this company is following these rules and so on. They're voluntary, but we show them. Or you can look at the products. They maybe have a swan marking or a keyhole marking or something to say something about the quality of this product. Is that sort of thinking something we could employ either with the platforms or with the content on these platforms to build trust? Yes, this has been verified to some degree, or we follow these rules or whatever.
Interesting question. I say people might discuss this, and I think we learned in living in that way. That's what the symbols as we look for in the shops. So why shouldn't we be able to look for symbols online? Maybe it's a way to go.
Yeah, I mean, at least when we talk about, again, the specific problem which I've been thinking a lot about and studied, which is the use of fake accounts to infiltrate political debates, particularly in other countries. I mean, what is being done right now is clearly not working, in the sense that Facebook, for example, announced proudly, actually, now in autumn, that they removed 5.4 billion fake accounts in 2019 alone, which is an insane number, right? And then at the same time, the few studies that have looked at how good are they actually at, like there was a NATO study where they bought a few fake likes for some posts, and then even reported those accounts to Facebook and just saw like how long will it take for them to remove it, and most of them weren't even removed after they reported it. So despite Facebook saying they removed 5.4 billion accounts, which they are kind of bragging about, we can see that in effect there are still so many fake accounts out there engaging in this kind of thing. Of course, most of them are used for marketing, like boosting likes on commercial platforms and so forth, or scams, and so it's not that it's all political propaganda, but clearly the way we currently authenticate accounts or detect fake accounts is not working. And so that could of course lead to debate about how can we increase that, or how could we make authentication better so that it's not so easy to create fake accounts. But the problem is right now, again, with the centralization of power, like I would certainly not propose, like right now, if Facebook is doubting whether you're a real account, they will shut it down, and then they will say you can upload a copy of your passport, and then we'll reopen it. But so suddenly, like now Facebook is starting to compile like archives of people's passports. I don't think that is a key solution for us to have that in a private company abroad. But at the same time, and we can also imagine situations where it's good to be able to have pseudonymous or anonymous accounts in, let's say, a country where homosexuality is illegal or there's death penalty for that, being able to use a fake account to meet other people. Like we can certainly see, or protesters in authoritarian regimes. So it's a very complex issue, but I think right now at least that is clearly not working, and Facebook and other companies are trying to make it seem as if what they're doing is working, but it clearly isn't. So I think that is a conversation we need to have. And again, if there was some kind of authentication, I think, for example, there in Scandinavia, we have a strong tradition of having trust in that being within some kind of public agency, where in the US, like uploading your passport to some kind of governmental agency, that is seen as something more threatening, right? So I think there, for example, again, if we were to have such an authentication solution, right now as a digital citizen in Denmark, where I live, I mean, we have authentication to log into all kinds of social security information and so forth, right? And I mean, that is at least a debate we could have. Could something like that work in the context of social media, or because right now we're not having it, and I'm not saying it's an easy debate, but it's clearly not working what we have right now. And it would really help if we had a better way of knowing who is actually a real person in Sweden and who is might be a fake account in this regard. Because again, that's the thing with the literacy part. It is really important to know literacy, but that is only going to detect the bad, like the not well-made disinformation. Like the thing we've been studying from the Russian Internet Research Agency, if I as a researcher had entered any of those fake accounts while they were running, there would have been nothing that I could have spotted which have showed that it was a fake account. They were well made and they knew what they were doing. So I mean, that will spot like the low-hanging fruit, but there are these like the most sinister campaigns. There it needs to be the social media companies. We need to force them to allocate more resources to find these type of accounts, we need much more access for researchers. It should be illegal for them not to give researchers access to data on all these fake accounts, for example. I, as a researcher, have no way of even verifying that they found 5.4 billion account, and much less do I know how many spread political information, how many targeted Sweden. All these questions are completely unknown to us. So yeah, there are so many things that can be done which are not being done, and one of them could be some kind of authentication.
First, if Carl had a response.
My responses are so long. I'm really sorry about that. It's such a research kind of academic.
I'll pass on it. Ida wanted to add something before.
I just wrote something down because I found it really interesting. I just read about a new study from Cambridge and Uppsala University, and the study finds that the online fake news game, it's called bad news, it can confer psychological resistance against common online misinformation strategies across different cultures. They have designed an online game in which players enter a fictional social media environment, and in the game, the players, they like walk a mile in the shoes of a fake news creator. And after playing this game, they found that people became less susceptible to future exposure to common misinformation techniques, an approach they call pre-bunking.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. More questions lined up in the audience. Yeah, we have a bunch over there.
Hello, and thank you for a great debate. I just had a question about a mixture of what you were talking about the journalists being afraid of the backlash. What happens when the campaign from the government, for example, goes in and stops hate speech? These people who are having these opinions are just going to move away from Facebook or from open platforms to closed platforms, and they're going to mix their opinions with more radical ideas. Isn't that a real threat against the democracy? Because then you have real lies mixed with a bit of truth, which engage a lot of people.
Very interesting question.
So the question would be sort of if government would prevent certain conversations of taking place in a different specific fora, it would move to another fora and might be even more radicalized. And that's sort of, and I would say that as far as I know, you can have seen some examples on that, and then you need to square that in relationship to sort of what is the risk of information being accessed by 1 million people in conversation to 1,000. There's sort of it ties into the sort of conversation of what's called deplatformation, etc. From a government perspective and from a Swedish perspective, there's really no place where the government has been a part of that scene or gone about sort of enacting laws or anything of that kind. When the government sort of, or when the state is, the sort of relationship between state and journalist speech in this case, that's just the laws around hate speech, basically. Sort of what are you allowed to do from a judicial perspective and not, and that is decided in courts, not by other situations. When an actor, journalist or not, becomes sort of deplatformed and moves from one place to another, that's usually due to the consequence of that platform making a decision about their own platform.
Thank you. We have time for one last question here. There.
Hi, I'll try to be as brief as possible. My name is Ingrid Bicu. I happen to be a member of the Election Commission in Romania, and I'm seconded here to the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. I've been working with manipulation propaganda for the last 14 years. First of all in Romania, because we used to be for a long time in our history under the influence of the former Soviet Union, so we had to be very able to protect ourselves from these attempts that are becoming more and more worrying these days, but for us were since the Cold War and even before it. So it's nothing new for us. It's nothing new for any of the countries in that region. It's nothing new for the United States, for sure. Even though they pretend to be surprised of what happened during the 2016 elections, only the battlefield has changed, but the war, the information war, is more or less using the same tactics. Very interesting discussion. I would be happy to be here anytime you're addressing this topic. But I do believe that it has to be a little bit more structured because it's extremely broad, and especially when it comes to elections. My question would be, even though I do have my own opinion, would you see a regulation of the entire social media related activities in terms of elections and election interference, or only a certain segment, and which would be that one? And maybe afterwards I will have the opportunity to tell you my opinion, or some other time.
Thank you so much for sharing this and for your question. Who wants to take this to begin with?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I think it's a really important point. Again, the newness in all of this, we shouldn't overemphasize that. And again, especially the surprise in the US about foreign interference was a bit weird, right, or ahistorical. And even on social media, one of the earliest known campaigns to create fake accounts to influence foreign debates, that was Operation Earnest Voice by the US back in 2010-11. So I mean, yeah, we shouldn't think of this as something completely new and mind blowing in that sense. And I think again, this debate points to that the key solutions are also more about talking about like the core foundations of democracy and how we protect that. In terms terms of elections, I think we should talk about. Of course, there are already regulations to like foreign money coming into election campaigns and so forth. And I think there should be at least. I mean, for example, in Denmark, Denmark has increasingly been criticized and repeatedly for not having transparent enough campaign donation transparency, and I think that could be increased, for example. And also on social media, we should have a debate about how much micro-targeting, should there be a limit to how micro-targeted people can be, how much companies can spend on micro-targeting during an election. So that would be regulation that directly targets social media, right? I don't know, like when you say that it targets all of social media, I'm not quite sure what that means. I think it should target all social media platforms if we, for example, made more transparency around campaign finance and also more reduction of the micro-targeting. And also, again, it should be by law that if social media companies detect disinformation, which they should be obliged to search for and investigate, they should share that with researchers and also journalists, which they are not doing at the moment. So I think there is regulation to be made around elections, but right now what we're seeing is that it's mainly around, again, content removal and censorship, which is not really solving the bigger issues.
Any short final words from Ida or Carl before we wrap this up? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for a great and interesting conversation here today. I think we all feel like we could continue this conversation. There's definitely a lot more to discuss and to dig deeper into. As I mentioned earlier, I feel like I should say it again. The Internet Foundation also has a few efforts where we're working with raising awareness of internet-related issues through initiatives such as Internetkunskap or Digitala Lektioner. So if you're interested in them, please check them out on our website. And if you want to follow up with us, you can stay around. I don't think they will have a lot of time to discuss, but if you're lucky, you might get a few words with them. And if you have any ideas of future conversations or discussions, panels that you think should be held here, please write to us, info@goto10.se. So thank you all very much for coming today. I look forward to seeing you again next time at Your Data and Your Democracy. Thank you, and thank you.